Welcome all of you to today's writers' discussion that's part of the annual meeting of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and the induction of a number of new members, two of whom we're very pleased to have with us today. The Hall of Fame has been around for several decades. It's permanently located in this building. If you would like to sort of get a sense of its history and some of the people who are in it, I would point out that the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame issue put out by the Georgia Review several years ago is available out in the hall. So Steve Corey, that's your mark. So I'm very pleased to be here today to be part of a discussion of two new members of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, Michael Bishop, who lives in Pine Mountain, Georgia, and Cynthia Shearer, who lives in Fort Worth, Texas. They were both born outside the state. They lived significant parts of their lives here in the state, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them. So I thought I would begin by asking Michael and Cynthia to talk about what the phrase Georgia writer means to them. Is it a mark of identification? Is it a limit? Is it something that really has no meaning? How does it figure into your sense of yourself as a writer? Either one of you can begin.
I'm used to that. Cynthia and I were just talking briefly about the fact that we both grew up, well, not all the way, I guess, but we both had...
We almost were military brats.
Right.
Almost.
Her parents, I'm not going to steal any of your thunder here, but she said her parents divorced when she was 3, right? And your dad was in the service?
Air Force. Yeah,
right.
like yours.
Well, my mother and father divorced when I was 5, and my dad was in the Air Force. And that took place in Tokyo, Japan, at least part of it took place there. I'm not going to tell a whole lot of stories about my mother. Usually I start off with an anecdote about her that usually makes everybody laugh, but I may save that. Well, are you coming tomorrow? Anybody? But I will say that I'm trying to pull my thoughts together here. I will say that I think growing up as an Air Force brat was something that made me feel very often that I did not have a home, a place that I could call home. It had to be located with my parents or with wherever I happened to be. Maybe I can get around that a little bit by saying that for a great period of my growing up, I was in Kansas. In fact, I have a book called Blue Kansas Sky, which consists of 4 novellas. But what happened ultimately is that I was telling someone earlier this evening that I started school in Tokyo, Japan. I went to Yoyogi Elementary School where the cherry blossoms bloom. We sang that little song upon occasion. And I remember going trick-or-treating in the American enclave there. And when I got home, that's all seasonal, isn't it? We're in the season of Halloween to some extent. My wife's looking at me like, get on with it. And I'm trying to. What I'm trying to say, and it's a good thing she's sitting right directly in front of me, keep me on track. What I am trying to say is that I believe that having lived in Georgia now since 1974 in the small town of Pine Mountain, continuously, without a break, except for taking trips, has been a wonderful thing for me. It's been something that I never expected, I never anticipated. I always imagined, I think, that I would be a peripatetic person for the rest of my life, that every few years we would pack up and move someplace. I think Jerry used to wonder when we would be driving through Idaho or something, I'd say, hey, this is lovely, we ought to stop and live here. And she's a Georgia girl, you know. And then we'd come back through that same town, you know, later in the day when it hadn't been hit by sunlight and whatnot, and it didn't look quite so attractive. And I think she was always relieved because she knew I was going to go back home to Georgia, you know. But I think one thing about living in Georgia is that it has given me a sense of connection and a sense of place that I think I've tried to develop in my work. My most recent book, my second most recent book is one called Other Arms Reach Out to Me, Georgia Stories. And all of the stories in it are either set in Georgia or have Georgians as characters. There are two stories that take place more or less overseas, but the characters are Georgians. And so even when I was writing primarily science fiction, if you take a look at my novels, you'll see that they are set in Georgia. Many of them are set in Georgia. Ancient of Days takes place in Atlanta and in Haiti. Count Geiger's Blues takes place in an alternate South in a state called Oconee, which really resembles kind of a melding of Alabama and Georgia. I'm trying to think where else to go with this. Probably I should say that, Philip K. Dick is Dead Alas, which was published originally as The Secret Ascension, takes place almost entirely in Georgia and in a colony on the moon. So, but the places that are described in Georgia are, in many instances, real places that we drove by. When I would go to Thomaston, for example, through Woodbury from Pine Mountain on back roads that not a lot of people travel. And I became interested in just the way they looked. And I tell you what, at this point, I think I'll shut up and let somebody else talk.
Well, I grew up down in the really flat part of the state where there were not terribly many bookstores, and so a lot of the books that were just kind of lying around when I was just learning to read were things that would not be lying around today, like Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus stories, or some of my mother's childhood books like Miss Minerva and William Greenhill. And there was this I remember some book that had a soft cover that was called Enos Africanus, and it was, I need to go back and read that book again and see what it really says. It was kind of impenetrable to me. I felt like you had to be a grown-up to understand it. But I think for me, the idea of a Georgia writer was somebody who was kind of bound to this place and bound to describe what was happening in this place. And somehow I knew that Uncle Remus and the tales about Brer Rabbit were kind of, they stood for something else. You know, that Southerners are great for telling you a story that you have to kind of figure out what the connection is or what the teaching is a little bit later. So for me, Georgia writer at first was that, you know, the childhood stuff. And then when I became an adolescent, in my part of Georgia, that was when the little old ladies kind of move in on you and try to appropriate your reading habits. And I had a jam-up reading teacher for first grade, and she kind of steered me towards the genteel ladies writers, and basically the ethic that she instilled in me was you just kind of read everything until the 1960s came. And then I think in 1967, my brother Lee, right here, who's a reporter for the Banner Herald, he says he doesn't remember this, but I swear to you, he had a job in a bookstore downtown. I want to say it was on Broad Street. And in that day, before the tax laws changed about how you had to how you got taxed on your inventory in bookstores. If you were going to return books, you just rip the cover off and send the books back. Send the covers back, and then you were left with all these magnificent books, except they had no cover. So when Lee was in college, he would ship boxes of books back to us down in South Georgia because we had no bookstores. And the first copy of The Water is Wide that I read by Pat Conroy had no cover on it. Roy Blunt just blew me away, no cover on that book. And I could name you any number of books. So in a way, Lee kind of got me through adolescence because he kind of appropriated my reading habits and made sure that I read more than just the genteel little old lady writers. And so I think for me, the first inkling that I had that being a Georgia writer was a really viable thing, and not, Sidney Lanier and the Marshes of Glen that he had to memorize in school, was that Pat Conroy book with the ripped off cover and Roy Blunt. And I'll never forget, doesn't Roy Blunt have a chapter titled, I think he was writing when Jimmy Carter got the Democratic nomination. I think the title of that chapter is Hot Damn, We Ain't Trash No More. Remember that? That was a big moment for me.
Sounds like a Louis Broussard title.
Yeah, and the little old ladies, I owe them a lot too, because I think Gone with the Wind is a really interesting book in its own way, So as far as being from Georgia now, I don't really know, but I'm excited that Georgia writers, I think if I had known about you, science fiction people, they don't play up where you're from or where you live or anything like that. But if I had known about you, I would have been all over that. I would have been totally excited that somebody is really doing it, even in 1974. So I think you're kind of, in that way, kind of a pioneer. Right.
I published my first book in 1975, and it was a paperback called A Funeral for the Eyes of Fire, which was set on 2 different planets, completely extrasolar, nothing to do with Georgia whatsoever. And the cover featured an alien being who had crystals for eyes. That was the image that made me start to write that book. And he's naked down to the waist. Fortunately, the cover doesn't go any further than that, and you can see the background behind him. But it's the kind of book that I can't imagine any parent letting a child have, I mean, so that's the kind of thing that you read under the covers at home with a flashlight.
I didn't read that book, but I can almost guarantee you that my high school boyfriend read that book.
Is that right? Well, he was probably one of 12 people then. It was actually published, but and it got some notice, but it didn't take off like, what am I trying to think of now? One of the Arthur C. Clarke novels.
So I wonder if there's a connection for either of you or both of you between the books you were reading back in your teens, in your early 20s, and your decision to be a writer, your discovery that you wanted to be a writer.
I don't want to be a writer. I mean, I never have.
Or that you were forced to be a writer.
I don't think that really clicked with me, until much later, after I was grown. I think, in my case, it was more basic than that I was reading just to make sense of things. And not just Georgia, but reading to kind of make sense of what was happening in the world and how the world was changing in the 60s. And another book that made a huge impression on me was one called Gothic Politics in the Deep South, another coverless wonder from Brother Lee, but it was a fantastic book. So, but for me, in the beginning, it was about just figuring things out, trying not to feel like you were in kind of some dead end on the literary family tree way down there in South Georgia, just trying to make sense of things. But that's not a good answer, but I don't think I've ever wanted to be a writer.
I knew from about the 8th grade that I wanted to be a writer, and I think it was because of the fact that I did an awful lot of reading of just all kinds of different things. My mother had lots of books in the house, and I didn't always read the books that she found, but I do remember that I ended up, when I was in, I think, the seventh grade, I ended up in the hospital because I had gone out for a middle school football team in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I was probably the smallest kid out there. I didn't get a lot of growth until I was maybe in my last year of high school. And I remember that about the third play, and I was wearing these things, I probably looked like a cactus, with clothes, these terrible shoulder pads and a helmet. Anyway, somebody clipped me at some point in that, and I was down 2 plays into this thing, and I wound up in the hospital. And I had a groin injury that apparently developed into a blood clot, and I was in the hospital, and I hated it. I mean, I just hated being in the hospital. And my mother, I said, please get me out of here. I can lie in bed at home. Take me home. And eventually she did. We got me out, and she went to the library there, and she brought 2 books back, and I remember those books vividly. Now I'm having trouble thinking of them. One of them was Gulliver's Travels, and the other one was Martin Eden by Jack London. Do any of you know Martin Eden by Jack London? You've probably read The Call of the Wild or White Fang. I saw some hands go up with Martin Eden. But Martin Eden, in many respects, was kind of an autobiography. Well, not an autobiography, but you felt like he was telling his own story up until the ending of the book, in which Martin Eden, throws himself off an ocean liner and drowns, commits suicide by throwing himself into the ocean. But those 2 books had a tremendous impact on me, especially the part of, where London was describing wanting to be a writer, growing up with no real education to speak of, being poor, living in California, San Francisco, and renting a small place somewhere near the waterfront, and constantly going to the dictionary and writing words out on slips of paper and clipping them to clotheslines that he had strung across his room so that he could read them, and learn those words. And that just sounded really romantic to me, a middle-class kid living in a nice suburban home, I wanted to be adventurous like Jack London was adventurous, and go to Alaska and pan for gold or set out on the South Seas and that sort of thing. So a lot of it was pretty unrealistic, but it got me fired up, and so did the dog stories that he wrote, White Fang and Call of the Wild, and I have a whole collection of Grosset and Dunlap dog stories. Silver Chief, Dog of the North. Does anybody remember those stories? Nobody. One person remembers them. Okay. And then I also got into, at the same time, collecting classics illustrated comic books, and I have a lot of those up in my attic at home. We're going to give them to the University of Georgia libraries. Gilbert? Where is Gilbert? Yeah, you want him? Sure. All right. And let me come back to the question and say, I really did start reading as a consequence of those things. Most of the kids that I knew bought Classics Illustrated comic books because they were assigned book reports in school, and it was a lot easier to read the comic book, and then you could recount the plot and that sort of thing. But I did something unusual, I think. I went to the books and read them themselves, and I got hooked on reading, really genuinely hooked on reading. And I knew that I wanted to be able to write something that entertained and moved me and touched me in the way that many of the books that I read at that time went. I got into Ernest Hemingway. I got into John Steinbeck. I got into Willa Cather. I think when I was in high school, I read Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage, which at that point was about the longest book I had ever read, and I was so proud of myself for just having read a long book. But that started it. And after that, I started going out in the backyard and dreaming about being a famous writer like William Faulkner or Ernest Hemingway, and then going inside and writing Ode to Beer. You know? Those were poems that I wrote, and I'm glad that they don't exist anymore. And I'll shut up.
I actually did write a book when I was in 7th grade, and it was about a litter of puppies that one of our dogs had, and I had like one chapter per puppy, and that puppy's fate, including my favorite one who got smashed in the street by a car. But I think I was always writing, but it really did not seem possible to me that anybody in my position in the world could be a writer unless it was once I realized about Conroy and Roy Blunt and those people that, wow, these people are actually out there doing it. But I kept journals constantly. I wrote constantly, but I never entertained the possibility of writing.
So I have a two-part question again for both of you or for either of you. Now, once you're in the middle of your career or as a writer, what gets you started on a particular story or a particular novel? What gets you started? And what's your routine when you get into the project, whatever it is?
I think I'll go. I know my answer will be shorter, so I'll go.
Well, I'll try not to go on too long.
No. For me, it's a sense of, oh my God, people don't know about this. I need to write about this. And that is getting more pronounced as I get older. As I've gotten older, I've gotten kind of ambivalent about having something in print at all times. But for an example, when I used to drive through Cuthbert on the way back from Ole Miss to visit my mother when I was in grad school, and there's a place where as soon as you come into that county, the earth is just like this big red gash, and there was a little store there on the left of that highway that would have sugarcane for sale at Christmas time and the whole thing. And I always felt when I hit that moment in the road that I was really back in Georgia as I understood it. And then you go around the square in Cuthbert and you drive on out of there. And then at some point when I started listening to Fletcher Henderson's music and getting interested in that town and just kind of reading around, and I had this moment when I realized, oh my God, I was driving past Fletcher Henderson's house all those years, and his childhood house, and I did not know it. And then as I got deeper into it, I realized that the New York music critics would always say of Fletcher Henderson, oh, he had a kind of attitude problem, and he could have had a more successful career if he had known how to deal, if he could have trusted white people in New York, he would have had a better career. Well, I was from Georgia. I knew exactly why he did not trust white people, I knew that whole song and dance. You didn't have to explain that to me. And as I got deeper into the research in it, I realized, oh my God, these music critics writing about Fletcher Henderson have no idea that there were lynched bodies dumped on their front churchyard across the street from the house Fletcher grew up in. And there are all these stories about Fletcher Henderson being locked in to practice the piano when he was a little boy. But that was Red Summer when all the lynchings were happening, and Cuthbert was having a lot of difficulties. And so for me, the thing that will propel me into it enough is the sense that somebody needs to know that this happened. There needs to be a record. Like, what is that line from, I think it's Thomas de Quincey, the Confessions of an Opium Eater. This is the record of the time. And so I think science fiction writers do the same thing, but y'all kind of disguise it. You're really writing about our time, but you're...
I know Ray Bradbury used to say that he used science fiction as a hammer. And that meant that he would write about subjects that were real, that were happening now, but he distanced them a little bit by placing them in the future or setting them in a different background. But he also felt that it was a good way to bring human beings to their senses upon occasion, by letting them see something in a different setting, in a different milieu, and as a consequence, allowing them to see that there were injustices happening there, and then suddenly realize, wow, this is a lot like stuff that's going on here now. I don't know how much I've done that, to tell you the truth. And I think that as far as my own writing goes, very often I have to be touched by an image of some kind. And like my first novel, I just developed this idea that I wanted to be a science fiction writer, partly because I couldn't sell my mainstream stories. But I also had in my background reading H.G. Wells and Ray Bradbury and some of the other writers in the field. And probably Bradbury was my main man, and I know there are a lot of science fiction writers who say that. But Bradbury was also very grounded in his own growing up in Illinois. And the books of his that I remember most vividly are the Martian Chronicles, which was the first thing of his I ever read, but also after that, Dandelion Wine, which is about growing up in a small town that he calls Greentown. I'm trying to remember the name of the town in Illinois that it actually belonged to. But to come back to this, I think very often in those days when I was trying to get started as a science fiction writer, because that was the place where I sold my first story, it was very often an image of some kind. The first story that I ever sold was called Pinion Fall, and it was set in southeastern Colorado because that was where I was living at the time. The image that came to me was of a creature with beautiful wings that's lying in the snow in a meadow in southeastern Colorado. And so that generated the story. I wish I could say that it had something more sociologically significant about it, but it was really the image itself and the strangeness of the image, and could I make it into a story? And it was the first story, as I say, that I felt like I had a chance of placing with a magazine. And I sent it off to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which was kind of that was the highest you could go if you had a story there. Anthony Boucher had been the editor there. And he really required some literary capability from the writers, whereas when you looked at Analog or Astounding, as it had once been called, and Galaxy, they were for the big concept, a big idea, and as long as you could write serviceable journalistic prose, it was okay. But I had this feeling that Bradbury always wrote with a touch of the poet, and that interested me, and I liked to do that sort of thing.
Neither of you said much about your routine, and so I'll rephrase that sort of question and ask whether you consider yourselves disciplined writers or undisciplined writers. Cynthia?
For me, when I first started writing seriously, I had a 2-year-old, and if you want to know what the real catalyst to kind of get serious about it was the birth of my daughter. Now think about that. You suddenly get this desire to write, and you have an infant. You have a 1-year-old. You have a 2-year-old, and so I learned to write. I wrote the Wonder Book of the Year half of it at my dining room table with toddlers playing with toys at my feet, which is like being able to sleep through a tornado. And the other half, I think the only way I got it finished, my husband was so, I cannot believe the patience he had with this, but I would, this was when I was curator of Faulkner's house, I would work all day for the university, go home, do the dinner. I would have the child in bed by 8:30 or 9, and I would drive back to Faulkner's house and sit in his kitchen and sit up all night. And I think that was, when you get to the end of a book, you kind of disconnect from the real world, and you have to just stay. I'm sure producing books, you have to just kind of stay with it till it's done. So I never had the luxury of a routine because I've always had day jobs. And oddly enough, in the few times when I did have, I had an NEA fellowship one time where ostensibly I was going to be home all day writing, and I found it almost impossible. So for me, it's kind of project driven. The discipline is assigned to the project, and maybe someday, I don't know, but not now.
I know this is going to sound like a real tautology, but I'm disciplined when I'm disciplined and undisciplined when I'm undisciplined. And it really depends very often on how deeply I am into a project. And I know that I'm probably a bear to live with when I'm between projects, or used to be. I think I've mellowed out a little bit. Jerry's looking at me. She's nodding, maybe. Well, okay. But what I would say is that I recall that Jerry and I lived here in Athens when I had gotten out of the service, and I was teaching freshman English courses here. And I taught composition, and I taught literature and composition to students who really, for the most part, didn't want to be in the classes. But I think, I did not find them painful to do, but the class I enjoyed the most was a sophomore literature survey when I got to deal with major authors, and I got into that just greatly. One of the authors was Jonathan Swift, and I go back to Gulliver's Travels now. But what I wanted to say is that, that took up a good deal of my time in that I had a lot of papers to grade from, 2 or 3 freshman English classes. But I would come home and I would write, and we had 2 small children, our daughter Stephanie and our son Jamie. And I will mention this right now. Jamie was killed at the University of at Virginia Tech on April 16th, 2007. And that's affected all of us tremendously. But he was a toddler then, and Stephanie was a baby. And we lived on Virginia Avenue, and when I came home, I tried to find time to write and work, and I can remember that Jerry pretty much, I sat in the midst of all this stuff that was going on, but Jerry kept those kids, occupied and busy while I was writing. But I can still recall listening to them as they were about the house. Later on, I got where I couldn't work unless I was in a room removed from things, and I sort of hated that, because it was kind of self-indulgent to some extent, I think. But the other thing was I knew that I wanted to be a full-time writer, and I got the opportunity when I was called in on my birthday, my second year at the University in Georgia, and told by the head of the department that they were letting me go. And it wasn't because of my performance, it was because they had decided that they were going to cosmopolitanize the faculty here, and I was a graduate. And so they felt that was kind of like incestuous, intellectual incest, to have people from their same institutions. So at that point, I was turned out and sent away. And Jerry and I moved into a home in Pine Mountain that had been in her family for a long time, and we had to remodel it and work on it. But I was working there with a little more discipline to produce work, because we were making almost no money, to be absolutely honest. $3,000 a year, $4,000 a year. We had savings from when I was in the service. Yeah, I was in the service for 4 years, and I taught at the Air Force Academy Prep School before I came back to Georgia. And so I'm pretty disciplined when I'm disciplined, and not too disciplined when I'm not.
I have specific questions for each of you, and I'll ask. Cynthia, you've already talked a little bit about a musician who got you started on a writing project, and I was very interested in the importance and the centrality of music in your novel, Celestial Jukebox. Could you talk about that?
That goes way back to the time I was living in South Georgia. Another thing that happened when Lee and my older brother Mark came up to the University of Georgia as students, for Mark it was 1964, for Lee it was 1967, but they were both really into music, especially Lee, and I would get their hand-me-down albums, and Lee had really Catholic taste, Catholic with a small c, tastes in music. So you don't know if it was going to be Howlin' Wolf or Led Zeppelin or Jefferson Airplane, and so I had just a huge reservoir of music at home that the record player was just going constantly. When I use the word record these days, my students hoot at me when I say, well, tell me what records you're listening to. And so that just kind of opened up a whole world right there. But I think, to be a little more honest, I think I'm some kind of frustrated musician, because I understand it, I think, when I hear it, but I can't tell you about it in an educated way, because I can barely read music. And so I think a lot of my interest in it is kind of vicarious, a wish, that I could do what some of those people could do. One kind of interesting thing, to go back to the Fletcher Henderson story, in my first book, I would play over and over and over Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. I would use music as a way to research the particular, that book goes forward in 10-year increments. And so I would just kind of saturate myself in the music and try to figure out what was changing across the decades in America. So I had this notion that I understood Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. But when I researched Fletcher Henderson, I realized, oh my goodness, almost everything I thought about that Sing, Sing, Sing is not exactly correct. So it's always revisionist, but I'm still that way. Music is like a kind of shorthand, shortcut to some kind of deeper understanding that in which language is not necessary, and I just really appreciate that.
Michael, I've got a more general question. Many readers know of you as a writer of science fiction. How aptly, in your opinion, does the term science fiction writer describe you?
I think it depends on which book of mine you look at. And I definitely got moved in the direction of science fiction because I didn't start out to be a new Ray Bradbury or a new Robert Heinlein. I mean, that wasn't my goal as a young person when I thought about being a writer. I really was thinking in terms of Ernest Hemingway or William Faulkner or Willa Cather or... But I did not meet with much success with the mainstream stories that I wrote and sent out. And I had a office mate at the Air Force Academy Prep School. His name was Klaus Kraus. I've told this story before. Jerry recognizes it immediately. That was his real name. He was a German American who was an American citizen. He could speak German, of course, and but he was both a physics major and an English literature major, and he was my office mate, the first person I met going into the service right out of the University of Georgia as an ROTC grad, ending up in Colorado Springs. I'd been in Colorado before. I have family there, had family there, and he said, I see you're having trouble with these stories that you're sending to the literary journals. Why don't you try to write some science fiction? He says, I see you read Ray Bradbury and H.G. Wells. Why don't you try it? Well, that story I told you about earlier, Pinion Fall, was one that I wrote, and I sent it to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which I subscribed to, and it bounced, as most of the other things that I sent there for a while did. And but then I sent it to Galaxy, that magazine that I said didn't have such high literary standards as the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And a man there by the name of Ayler Jacobson bought the story, and he called Jerry at home in Colorado Springs and said, I've got a beautiful story here, a wonderful, beautiful story here by Michael Bishop. Can you tell me anything about this? And she said, well, he's not here, he's at work. And I thought, oh, you're not supposed to tell him that. I'm supposed to be a full-time writer. And anyway, he called me at work, and my office at the Air Force Academy had a huge window behind the desks that Klaus and I sat at. And I stood up to answer the phone, which was on the sill of that window looking out over the housing area there. And he said the same thing he had told Jerry. Well, I don't know, maybe he told me, but he said, I've got a beautiful story here by somebody named Michael Bishop. Would $100 be all right? And, I started floating. I felt like I was going to go out and, through that plate glass window and hover over the housing area there at the Air Force Academy. It seemed wonderful to me. And I told that story to another friend of mine at the Air Force Academy, Mike Brown, who had the office down the hall. And when I said, he said, would $100 be all right? And Mike looked at me and said, did you ask him if you could pay it off in installments? What was the question?
I don't know, but that's a good answer.
But in any event, that was really my first story sale. But my first professional sale was to the Georgia Review. I was in a creative writing class with Marion Montgomery, and I wrote a poem that was based very much on the work of John Keats and Alan Tate. Alan Tate's the Ode to the Confederate Dead, and of course all of the wonderful odes that John Keats wrote. And I wrote a poem called An Echo Through the Timepiece, which uses the stanzaic pattern of one of the Keats poems, one of the Keats odes. I'm trying to remember which one now, An Ode to a Nightingale. In any event, Marion Montgomery said, well, you ought to send this to the Georgia Review. And he sent it to James Colvert, who was the editor of the magazine at that point, the journal at that point, the Quarterly, and he accepted it. So that was my first professional sale, acceptance, whatever you want to call it. And that was good. That was good.
So let's pause here and ask for any questions that people in the room would like to ask of either or both of these writers. Yes, one back there.
I was in freshman in high school when Sputnik went over, and Homer Hickam, who wrote the Rocket Boys that ran into October Sky, I rushed to the library and started reading science fiction. And I wondered, did you ever have that kind of experience?
I think the experience with me was, I can't remember how I got a hold of my first copy of the Martian Chronicles, but that book really did it for me. And I can remember I know what it was, one of my friends at that time started telling me this story that just had the weirdest, aspects to it, and set on another planet, on Mars. And as a consequence of that, he finally remembered the title, and I think I bought it at a discount store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and started reading it. But the thing that caught me the most about it was his use of language, which to me at that time seemed just absolutely wonderful. I think as I got older and older, I saw that he had certain tricks that he did over and over again, but I still have a strong affection for the work nonetheless. But I think what got me was the titles of pieces that I talked about. Sometimes he would use bits of literature, like Something Wicked This Way comes from Shakespeare, or I Sing the Body Electric, which comes from Walt Whitman. But he had wonderful titles like Dark They Were and Golden Eyed, A Medicine for Melancholy. And these were the kinds of things that touched me. And when I got into science fiction, I found that there were other writers who used that. Roger Zelazny was a writer that I was very interested in, and Samuel R. Delaney coming along in the 60s. They were part of the new wave that were kind of reacting against Asimov and Clarke, and they were trying to infuse the field with more literary qualities than they felt that it had in the past, which was exactly the thing that the fans of science fiction hated. They didn't want that. They wanted the big ideas and the rocket ships and the aliens. Well, I wanted all of those things together, and I'm thinking of titles now in specifically. But Samuel Delaney had a story that he called Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones. You like that? I ended up later in my career writing a story called Life Regarded as a Jigsaw Puzzle of Highly Lustrous Cats. It's a good story. I don't know. I guess what I think about very often is that W.H. Auden said, he had a student come up to him once and said, I'm really interested in being a poet because I think poets have these wonderful ideas and I have great notions that I want to communicate to mankind. And Auden said to him, I think you'd probably be better off if you had great interest in the English language. And I've always felt that way about it a little bit, so I'm not sure that I came at science fiction from the same direction that other people did. But believe me, there are things in science fiction that I still look back upon with great fondness, including work by Arthur C. Clarke in particular. I think he had a little bit of the poet about him, too. I don't know whether that answers your question.
I'd like to know a little bit more about Ancient of Days and the genesis of a Homo habilis character.
I'll try to make this brief. I got very interested at the University of Georgia in anthropology. I mean, I had Dr. Hudson was teaching an honors English class in anthropology, and I took the basic course. And I remember we read books by Colin Turnbull, and one of them was The Forest People, about the Ituri the pygmy of the Ituri rainforest. And he had us as an exercise to write an ethnography. Write an ethnography, he said. And I ended up writing an ethnography based on the dorm arrangements that I was living in and how my roommate or some people in the dorm had divided off their rooms between each other because they had an argument or something, and just some of the, and the role of the house mother in the dorm, this sort of thing. He really liked it, and Dr. Hudson really liked it. But later on, one of the first stories that I wrote that gained any prominence was called Death and Designation Among the Asadi. That was how I got started, really, I think, writing science fiction. And you're asking about Ancient of Days. Well, I got into the origins of humankind, and I began reading books like Boca's Brain by Sagan and The Dragons of Eden. And Homo habilis became, this creature became extremely important in my view of how human beings evolved. And I thought, what if one of these creatures showed up in contemporary Georgia? And so I had it set in a small town in Georgia where this creature shows up and what happens as a consequence of that. And I think I've talked enough.
Other questions?
I have a
Lisa?
question for Cynthia.
Yeah.
Anyone who reads your fiction is very aware of how important music is to your writing. And I was wondering what you're listening to now. What's on your turntable?
I no longer have a turntable.
They're back.
My husband and my daughter make fun of me because I still play CDs. I was talking with Professor Lowe a few minutes ago about, he asked me a really interesting question nobody's ever asked me before, and that was, if you wrote a biography, who would it be? And I said Norma McCarthy, who is a folk singer. You might know her from her singing with her husband, Watterson McCarthy. Her daughter is Eliza McCarthy. Her husband's name is Martin Mccarthy. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of these people. They live in England, and they go back to days of like the Fairfield Four. And Norma McCarthy, I believe, is almost 80 now, but she knows all the old Elizabethan ballads, and she knows all the American Appalachian ballads, and she thinks like Emma Goldman thinks, and she knows the labor history of the U.S., and she has this she's on Facebook, and she does these marvelous Facebook posts that are like free association, and what she fed her grandchildren for supper, and the whole Brexit fiasco, and it's like Molly Bloom on Facebook. And so I've been listening to a lot of her work, and I use a lot of music in teaching, so very often what I'm listening to is what I'm about to inflict on my students. Like I think it was last Monday, I played Big Science by Laurie Anderson and tried to explain to them how that was relevant to the kind of paranoia that a lot of people have about science now. So I listen to everything, but I will even listen to rap on the recommendation of my students, and they fed me some really excellent names and convinced me I need to kind of up my game a little bit, and that rap has changed, since Ice-T. So that's probably going to be my next thing.
Can I interject something here real quickly? I was talking about titles a while ago. I've just started reading Cynthia's works. I finished A Wonder Book of the Air and really, really liked it. And I'm halfway through, well, not quite halfway through. I'm glad I have more left of The Celestial Jukebox. But if you talk about titles, I just look at the chapter titles in here, and these are the kind of things that would have set me off when I was a teenager. And I still get, no, listen. In the Orchard of Abandoned Dreams, I go down here, Nocturne with Black Escalade, Still Life with Shotgun and Oranges, In the City of the Caesars, The Celestial Jukebox itself. There are a lot of wonderful titles, chapter titles.
It would be interesting to see what you would do with those titles.
It would be fun it would be fun to do that. I have taught at workshops, science fiction and fantasy workshops, or just writing workshops, and sometimes you will just say, write a story with this title. And sometimes that turns out to be pretty good. Sometimes the students get excited about that sort of thing. I can see getting into any one of those. A Gasoline Sutra. I don't know, but anyway, I really enjoy that sort of thing.
Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Oh,
So this has been a great discussion.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to both of you. I believe the recognition induction ceremony for new inductees into the Hall of Fame is tomorrow at 10 in this room. I believe I may be wrong, that copies of the works of some of these writers are out in the hall. So please go have a look at them. And once again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Michael and Cynthia.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah. It would be great to go. Yeah. Yeah. It's wonderful. Hey, Lisa.